Well, hi once again, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. And you know what I say, unexpected comes up more often than not, and that's what makes it so much fun. Today, we get to chat with an upcoming author, Kristina Mand-Lakhiani. And Kristina has been working on a book, and it will be and is out by the time that you get to hear this, which is great, but we're recording it prior to it coming out so that we're all prepared when she gets done with all the edits. And she was just telling me that she's gone through and hopefully edited it for the last time. We'll see about that, Kristina.
I actually think for this print, it's for the last time, but who knows? Hopefully it will go well and I'll go for a second print. But well, Michael, thank you for having me. And yeah, I appreciate it a lot.
Well, it's my pleasure. And we're really grateful for you being here and talking with us. I'd like to start by learning a little bit more about you, maybe growing up. I know you come from Estonia, and yes. I'd love to learn about kind of the younger Kristina and all that stuff.
You know, it's funny because as we were just chatting that I had to go through my book once again, and I noticed suddenly that actually quite a lot of the book is influenced by the fact that I was born in the Soviet Union, because I refer to that. I remember even somebody from my audience once saying, why can't you just let go of that past? But it's such an interesting idea. Do we have to let go of our past, or can we just appreciate it for what it is and appreciate it for making us what we are? So I'm not like, I don't consider myself traumatized by the Soviet past, but some of the things that I share do sound a little bit funny, and not funny, actually, a little bit odd, probably. But yes, I was born in Soviet Union. I was raised in Soviet Union, grew up in that country. I was 14 when it collapsed. So I have very conscious memories of how it was to be in that very restrictive environment. Nowadays, of course, people have hard times imagining it, but I guess the closest comparison would be North Korea, if you can imagine that, only much, much bigger. It was a human life in every sense of the word, but of course it was a very restrictive society. It was very idealistic, and some things which are normal nowadays were not part of my reality. For example, being entrepreneur, there was no business, it was legal, or personal growth, even for that matter. I believe I'm very skeptical and a little bit of a nerd because of my Soviet upbringing. So these things are probably what influenced me.
Well, and in reality, I really find it interesting what you said before, and it is so unfortunate to forget your past. That's part of what makes us who we are, no matter what our past is. And I love to tell people, when I think about my life and so on, I can trace back to a great degree the choices I've made and how those choices have made a difference or made me do the things that I do today. So forgetting about what your past was, as long as you keep it in perspective, is never something that we should do, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree. And we can talk about past, or we can talk about certain aspects of us as human beings. And, we always have a choice what we do with what is given to us. I think I'm partially paraphrasing right now. Gandalf, who replied to Frodo's complaint that why was it my lot to bring, to take care of that ring to roll them all? And Gandalf said to that, you don't get to pick the times when you were born, but you always get to pick what to do with those times, or get to choose. Of course, I'm paraphrasing this quote.
Right.
So I think that's the case about your past. That's the case about you as a human being and everything that has happened to you, where you were born. You never get to choose a lot of those things, but you always get to choose how you treat what you have been given.
Sure. And the other part about it is that we stress so much about so many things. In reality, one of the lessons I learned from being in the World Trade Center and escaping on September 11th is we didn't have control over the World Trade Center happening. And I'm not convinced, I suppose somebody will prove me wrong someday perhaps, but I'm not convinced we really could have figured it out. The people who did it kept it a pretty well-guarded secret, and they succeeded. We can't worry about the things that we can't control. What we can worry about, or what we should focus on, are the things that we can, and let the rest go, because it's not going to do us any good to fret about them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And it's not in the case of September 11, of course, there may be different opinions about could it have been prevented or not. But there are a lot of things that could not have been prevented. You know, when I don't know, maybe volcano erupting is not anymore a good enough excuse, but things happen which are completely out of human control. I like quoting fictional characters. So there's another fictional character from one of my favorite novels, Master and Margarita, and he's like he's the devil in essence, and he says human is mortal, and that would have been half the problem. The real problem is that the human is mortal unexpectedly. I know it's a little bit of a morbid quote, but it also has a little bit of a humor in it. That's the essence of life, that it's unexpected and unpredictable. So what's the point of fretting about what you don't know?
Right, exactly. And, you know, the reality is life being somewhat unpredictable is a lot of fun. And if we can't approach life from a fun standpoint, if we take ourselves and life so seriously that we can't find relief or just plain joy in the unpredictability, then what good are we?
I know that humor, for example, is one of the coping strategies which is considered healthy for you. And coping strategies are those things that we do when we are faced with the reality which we don't want or we didn't expect. So humor is definitely one of those things which is very healthy for you and helps to deal with adversity.
Yeah. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with humor. I think, again, it's like anything else. It's how we do it and what we do with it. If we use it in a positive way to uplift us and to uplift others, that's great. If we do it to abuse or pick on someone, that's not necessarily a good thing.
But that's not necessarily humor. That might be
right.
bullying.
That might be bullying. You're absolutely right. You know, I love to talk sometimes about Don Rickles. Are you familiar with him?
I've heard, but no, I'm not familiar with his
So he
work.
used to be known before, well, he passed, but he used to be known as Mr. Warmth. And what he did is he came out on the stage and he loved to pick on people. And he was pretty hard on people and brutal. But I saw an interview with him once on the Phil Donahue show back in, oh gosh, it must have been in the 80s sometime. And one of the things that he said was that he always watched his audience. And if he felt that somebody was getting truly offended by him picking on them, he'd stop. He would not pick on them because it was all supposed to be in fun.
You know, I'm thinking that he must have been very confident in his ability to read people's emotions. But with that said, my favorite type of humor is when people laugh at themselves. I think it's the healthiest kind.
Yeah. And he was very capable of doing that. No question about it. And he also had so many other comedians pick on him as well in fun ways. And so I think that he was a person who could truly read the emotions of people. I think probably in that kind of a setting, it would have been relatively easy to do based on expressions of people and how they're reacting if he's looking at them or picking on them and so on. But still, he had to be good at what he did. And as far as I know, everybody who really stepped back and looked at him felt that he did a good job. I know there are a lot of people who say, oh, he just abused people and he picked on people, but I don't think they looked at him and they don't think they really analyzed what they were seeing.
I can't comment on that because I haven't seen the show, and it does sound like a slippery slope, honestly, because some people
could be.
Some people assume that they understand the effect of their words on other people, but we don't always know what other people feel, and people don't always show what they feel. So
true.
Yeah.
Well, I think if people go to his show, they went because they expected to mostly be picked on, because that's what his reputation was. But when I listened to a couple of his albums and so on, I've never did get a chance to go to one of his shows, but it seemed to me that he really did try to keep on the right side of that slope. And I know that if I had ever had a chance to meet him in person, if I had ever had a chance to go to one of his shows and he started to pick on me, I would just get up and say, yeah, well, I took one look at you and haven't been able to see since. So what do you think of that? Never got the chance.
You see, you're laughing at yourself. That's much better.
Oh, absolutely. Where's the fun without doing that?
Yeah.
Well, so the Soviet Union collapsed, and then what did you do? What happened with your life?
I was a teenager when the Soviet collapsed, so I just went on with whatever I was doing. But things around me started changing dramatically, and it was a hard time for a lot of people who actually didn't like uncertainty, and that was a lot of uncertainty. You know, the things. There was one thing about Soviet Union which was, in a way, a lot of people regret losing it, was the freedom to not have to choose. Because choices were done for you, and I do actually wonder how many choices people enjoy doing. I think there's statistics, there's research that says that we are only comfortable with about like 2.5 choices, but there was some kind of lightness in the knowing that everything had been decided for you, and you just go with the flow. I like comparing it to a life of a pet. You kind of have a good life, but you belong to someone.
Yeah.
And that changed. So there is certainty in somebody else making decisions for you. And suddenly that certainty was taken away. So a lot of people I know suffered. I was a teenager, of course, it was easier for me to adjust, but it wasn't the case for everyone. And yeah, people don't like uncertainty. It's, I think, a very understandable analogy for contemporary people would be why so many people prefer working for someone else or like in a big corporation rather than doing their own business. Because if you look into the essence of things, you're as vulnerable to, let's say, economic crisis or things happening on not being under your control, but you have the illusion of not having to make decisions, not being responsible when you work for someone else. So that was literally the comparison. Soviet Union was the country which removed the necessity to make any decisions.
Right. Which could be a good thing, but it could be a bad thing based on the fact that then everything changed and people did need to start to make more decisions for themselves.
I think it was a really bad thing. You know, it's sometimes we like to be safe and comfortable, but if your executive functioning drops because of that, then what's good in that?
Well, exactly right. And the reality is that I think as humans, we were born to have the capacity to make choice. And I think in the end, probably enough people felt that way, that was part of what would have caused the Soviet Union to fall. They didn't like the fact that they didn't have any control over their lives and other people wanted to have full control over their lives. And that dichotomy is always going to be a problem.
I agree, yeah.
So I can appreciate that. But it is interesting that so many people, as you point out, felt very uncomfortable after the Soviet Union fell, that now they had to make decisions and didn't know how.
Mm-hmm. I think in contemporary Western society, there is still a lot of indecisiveness, even though we're given the choice. But decision seems like a hard thing.
Yeah. Well, we see it here. There are so many times that people won't make choices. And as is always also pointed out, by not making a choice, you're making a choice. And and then when you don't like the choice that somebody else made because you didn't, who do you have to blame? Only yourself. Yeah,
I actually agree that the indecision is a choice in itself very often. It's just a very comfortable excuse. I am trying to make a choice. Choice is so important. And very often behind that story is just fear of change, because indecision is the choice to leave things the way they are, not to make a change.
Yeah, it's something that we all need to learn to do. And the fact is, I think that ultimately we are responsible for our lives. We can collaborate, we can seek advice, but if we don't make choices and we allow someone to make them for us, then we only have ourselves to blame.
That's true. Yeah.
So but you went on as a teenager, you finished school, and then what did you do? Did you go to college or did you just make other choices?
No, my choice was predetermined because I was a teenager when Soviet Union collapsed, so I was still on the same track for a while. I went to university, a good degree, and I started my work in the government. That decision had been made in Soviet days. I wanted to be a diplomat because that was the only way I could imagine seeing the world and having some freedom and having a little bit more exciting life. But of course, by the time when I went to university, it wasn't already the only way to do what I wanted to do. I guess there were several reasons why I went into government, and I started my career there. I made a career pretty fast, also partially due to our history, because in Estonia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the people who came to power were very decided that you cannot allow people who had been in the power during Soviet times to stay. So the change happened. And everybody who had been in, let's say, in the Middle Ages, they had been in the Soviet government. So literally, very young people came to power, and I was 25 and I had made a very spectacular career in the government. But then I got married and moved to New York, and I had to start everything from scratch in the new environment.
So you were 25 when you moved to New York?
Mm-hmm. When I married and moved to New York, I was 25, and I didn't have a visa I had a visa to stay, but not to work. So it was a huge trial for me because being a perfectionist, straight A student all my life, very ambitious, having made a career very early, coming to New York and not having even the right to work. And my education was alien to American companies. Mm-hmm. They would ask at the interview, "Do you speak English?" Which was really ironic because we'd be speaking English. And yeah, that was
Don't you love it when people are observant?
Yes. But yeah, it was a blow to everything. I imagined that the life would be like it was until 25. But then I had to reinvent things.
What did you study in university?
Politics, international politics.
You studied politics. Okay, great. Yeah. Well, so what caused you got married and moved to New York? What caused that to happen, especially the move?
So I married Vishen, who is the famous founder of Mindvalley. I'm the less famous co-founder of Mindvalley. And he lived in New York at that time. So when we got married, I just moved to live with my husband. That was the reason.
Well, has that marriage gone well?
Our relationship has gone well, but marriage is no more. We separated 4 years ago, but we are in good relations, and we're still a family.
Well, that's good. You have children?
Yes, we have 2 children, and the third big baby is Mindvalley, so we have business together as well.
And that's the demanding baby, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that they are all good source of education and self-discovery. They're all very important and unique, but I think human babies are more enjoyable.
Well, yeah, and that's in part because as they grow up and get more mature, they get to be unpredictable too.
Oh, yes, they are unpredictable. Yes, they are.
How old are they?
So mine are 9 and 15.
Good.
It took me a moment to remember.
Good ages for unpredictability by any standard.
Yes.
Well, so what did you do about work once you moved here? Did you go into Mindvalley or do other things?
Yeah, in New York, since I was not allowed to work legally, the best thing I could do was to help with vision with Mindvalley. So usually when people ask me how I ended up in Mindvalley, I say it's by accident and reluctantly in a way, because I wanted to make my own career, work for UN or something like that, but it wasn't on the cards for a while. But I was searching myself for quite a few years. It was in my early 30s when I decided to try just doing Mindvalley work. Until then, I was doing a little bit of charity, working for different UN branches, getting another degree. So searching myself, and I believe that all this education went for good cause, but sometimes when something is meant for you, you are going to end up doing that sooner or later.
Yeah. Well, tell us about Mindvalley, since we've dropped that name a number of times now.
It's it is my main job for the past 20 years. So I was bound to drop the name a few times.
Well, and that's perfect.
It is one of the world's biggest platforms for education, personal growth, and transformation. And we've been around for quite a lot of years. We work with the world, probably leading world authors and teachers in our industry. But it's also maybe a little simplistic to explain it in these terms, because I mean, in 20 years, of course, we've grown and evolved, and our mission is to help people to live happy, fulfilled, extraordinary lives.
How do you do that? What does Mindvalley do?
By sharing, finding the teachers. Well, first of all, we find the gaps in our knowledge as humanity, what humanity lacks, what humanity needs to understand. Because academic education gives you the academic knowledge, not the knowledge about life. Like if we take simple everyday things such as parenting or building relationships, even health, we don't learn that in school. It's usually up to you to figure it out when you adult. So we see what humanity needs. We find teachers who are the best in their field to explain, to teach, to coach, to lead the way, and then we just help those ideas spread.
Do you, among other things, publish?
We do our own format of publishing. We have online courses on our own platform, and we publish this way. And we also have events, and we have a big community. So as I said, it's a little unfair to explain Mindvalley in 2 sentences.
Well, that's okay. We have time for whatever you want to explain, but I appreciate what you're saying. If I start to think about different areas where humanity sometimes does things and sometimes does strange things, or we have interesting conceptions and misconceptions, kind of for me, the first one that comes to mind is happiness. And, everybody wants to be happy. They talk about being happy, but yet if you ask people what their goals are, happiness doesn't tend to be one of the first things they mention, which is interesting.
I absolutely agree, because it's not even not one of the first things to mention. I have seen a lot of people's goals, and I almost never have seen personal happiness as being a goal for the year, say 2023. And I think there is an explanation to that. If you listen to the contemporary discourse about happiness, we are blasted the idea that you can't pursue happiness. You can't go after it. Like even if you check out TED Talks about happiness, there's often something like, don't go for happiness, go for meaning. Don't go for happiness, go for that. So we are told that happiness is unattainable, and no wonder. That's one reason why people might not consider happiness important. The other reason is I've noticed that a lot of people feel guilty wanting to be happy. I guess that comes from this idea that you have to sacrifice your own well-being for something bigger. And I know it very well, coming from Soviet Union. That was the mentality of the whole country, that individual human being doesn't matter, big cause matters. But that kind of martyrdom complex is actually quite characteristic to a lot of people, especially people who are interested in personal growth and transformation. People come to help the world become a better place. They want to give, they want to, to leave a mark. And that somehow, in a lot of people's minds, contradicts with the idea that you might want to be personally happy. And that I find so ironic and also unfortunate, because people actually give up the idea that they could pursue their own happiness because they think it's selfish. It's not correct. It's not right. It's not noble enough. So these are the two reasons that I see why people don't value happiness enough or don't talk about it seriously enough.
Well, let's take it in a slightly different way. Do people know what happiness is?
We mostly think that we do because it's such a trite word. But if you were to look beyond the surface of the word, then I guarantee you that if 5 people talk about happiness, discuss happiness, there are 5 different understandings of happiness in that conversation. I guess the most common way we explain happiness is as an emotion or a feeling, which is, in my opinion, a huge mistake, because emotions by nature are transient and volatile, and they don't stick. So if you equate happiness to an emotion or a feeling, then of course it's not going to be a sustainable thing.
Well, how would you define happiness? Or if you were to try to help somebody understand it, what would it be?
I would like people to, or society to shift happiness from the domain of emotions to the domain of states. So, for example, if you look at classical psychology, there is no research of happiness, by the way, but there are things which are very, very close to that, like positive and negative affectivity are very similar to happiness, or the theory of how the theory of explanation, how you explain events. There are different patterns, thought patterns that are characteristic to people who are optimists and pessimists. Of course, I'm using common language,
sure.
Optimists and pessimists. So there are theories that kind of touch upon the idea of happiness. But what I found really interesting about psychology is that when we talk about stress, we talk about chronic stress, for example, or anxiety or depression. These are recognized as states which are there to stay, obviously. And we treat them as such. But then we don't have a state for the opposite. Somehow there is no research which would equate happiness to a state. And state is a much more stable thing. Although maybe I'm a little bit unfair, because the theory of hedonistic, I think hedonic adaptation or hedonic treadmill, I might butcher the words a little bit. That is probably the only field of science which is attempting to equate happiness to a state rather than an emotion.
It seems to me that if we're going to talk about being happy, one of the things that's important is that we have some sort of positive view of ourselves. We must have some level of confidence or feeling or thought that what we're doing is okay. But still, that's only one small dimension of it, because ultimately, if we're going to be happy, then it seems to me that we must believe that something is going right for us in the world.
It's, I think this comment invites a philosophical view.
Sure.
View on the things, because how can we? I think that it's a mistake to imagine happiness as some kind of some kind of blissful state without.
Right.
Without anything painful in it. It's a mystic state which doesn't exist,
Right.
and very often our well-meaning parents actually kind of induce that idea on us, because loving parents, they try to make the environment for their children without pain, without discomfort. They solve all the problems for their children, or at least they try to go and save the day. So when we grow up with an idea that happiness is absence of pain. Because if the child is crying, the parent goes crazy and thinks, how do I make this child happy? When they're a little bit more grown up, reaction is slightly different, but the idea stays the same, that happiness is this eternal bliss. And my favorite thing to say, that would be half the problem. The real problem is, because of that aspiration to solve all the problems for our beloved children, we also deprive them of any functional skills to deal with the pain, which is inevitable. So kids grow up thinking that happiness is the state of bliss where nothing unpleasant happens. And with that, we also don't have the skills to deal with the unpleasantness of life, which is inevitable. Since I love quotes, here I'd like to quote Susan David. She is a PhD in psychology, and she says, discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. So, on one side, happiness has to be a more stable condition than just an emotion. But on the other side, what happiness definitely isn't, it's not a state of perfection and bliss and absence of pain.
As I think about some of what you're saying, and I like and appreciate what you're saying, it seems to me that one of the things that could make us happier is knowing that we can deal with, say, when pain comes along or something unexpected comes along, that we have found some ways to at least start to deal with it, or that we can be open to figuring out ways to address whatever issues are negative in our lives. And just by learning to do that and by addressing them, even if it's just internally, that's part of what it seems to me makes a person happier, because I can sit there and go, I was able to deal with that.
Also, I think very often the unpleasant experiences are an invitation to discover something new. And if we, as society, encouraged actually curiosity in our everyday life, I think it would make a lot of suffering much lighter. I actually would encourage people who are listening to approach everything with curiosity. I was just now thinking of an analogy. I remember when, as a kid, I used to like to do very bizarre things, like you would roll down a hill and get up and the whole world is spinning. And it's such an exciting state. Now, as a grown-up, if I were to do that, I'd probably be very uncomfortable, because I don't like discomfort. I wouldn't do that just because I wouldn't enjoy the quick, how to say, the pukey feeling. Sorry for the directness. But that's the difference between approaching your life with wonder and not being too judgmental. Something is good, something is bad. Can you just ask yourself a question? What does this experience say? What does it carry? What kind of information does it carry? What can I learn about myself, about the world, about people in the world? And I think once you approach things with curiosity, it removes quite a lot of suffering.
Well, I think we so much discourage curiosity. Don't touch that, you tell a child, or don't do this, or adults tell each other, don't do that. That's not an appropriate thing. That's not the way to act. That's not the way to explore this. And we so greatly discourage curiosity. And I love to be curious. And I've been in places. I was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York at MoMA. And I was there with my wife and I think it was just the two of us. We were next to a statue, and I reached up and I just touched the foot of the statue that was on a pedestal, and immediately a guard came over. You can't touch it. You can't do this. You can't do that. In reality, there are statistics that show that if you allow people who can't see the same things that you can see the opportunity to at least interact with them by touching them, you're not going to damage the artistic piece. But they were so locked into one mindset that there was no way even to touch the foot of this statue, which wasn't going to be damaged by my hands doing it. Or they could have had a mechanism so that I could have touched the statue by first maybe using a towelette and making sure there was no oil on my fingers. But there wasn't the opportunity to observe, which is extremely unfortunate.
Yeah, and not very fair.
And not very friendly. But I will say I've never been back to MoMA since.
Oh, wow.
Well, I wouldn't get anything out of it. So, you know, it's not the same. People can sit and describe or stand and describe things, but it's not the same as interacting. And you get to interact because you can see it. And I don't look at things using the same techniques that you do, but I should be allowed to have that opportunity. And it's something that just tends not to happen. And again, so we discourage curiosity. People ask me all the time, how can you be happy because you can't see? And my response a couple of times has been, how can you be happy when you can? There's so much that goes on in the world that you talk about the horrible things, you watch all the horrible things on the news, and I can hear about them too. But why is it that eyesight needs to be a requirement for happiness?
Well, I believe a lot of things are not a requirement for happiness. And you know, I had a friend, unfortunately, he's gone by now, but he had a very unusual genetic condition. So he had brittle bones, and his mom once told him, of course, I can never do justice to the story, but I just love the sentence that his mom told him. She said, "Are you going to make it your curse or your blessing?" And that's an interesting thing. In your case, your condition is very extreme, maybe, and
so is yours.
But I was leading to that. But very often, you know, we maybe have conditions like being born in a crazy country is probably also a little bit of an extreme condition. But I agree. You know, it's your choice. Can you be happy or not? After all, there is research about happiness and the happiest countries in the world. The happiest countries in the world, surprisingly, are not the richest countries in the world. So our understanding of what makes us happy is just in children's shoes. And when you were talking about how people say, how can you be happy if you can't see? I was reading a book. I unfortunately, I don't remember which of them, about happiness. But there was this interesting philosophical discussion about people who maybe don't have all the physical abilities of a healthy person, and how can they be happy? Well, the thing is that we feel emotions in very different ways, and my happiness and your happiness may be different. My fear and your fear may be different. And it doesn't mean that, you know, somebody's happiness or fear or pleasure or pain are of any better quality. You know, when one of the wonderful writers, Viktor Frankl, he's describing life in concentration camps, and you know, in our contemporary society, we have this idea that first world problems, like why do you complain, why do you whine if there are people who suffer more than you? But who can tell the difference between suffering and suffering? Our psychology is built in a way that some people may suffer from what another person might deem not a big deal more acutely than another person would suffer from, for example, not having an eyesight, or not having a limb, or not having, hearing. So we can't really judge other people's feelings, and I think we shouldn't, honestly. We should let people choose for themselves.
Well, and I think you really just hit the nail on the head, if you will. It's still all about choice. And I think happiness in part is also all about choice. And we may define happiness somewhat in different ways based on our specific environments and our feelings, but we can choose on any given day or with any situation to be happy or not. I mean, we joked earlier about your working on editing your book, and you're glad you got through that. But that editing job can be something that makes you happy, or it can make you extremely frustrated, and that's a choice.
It is, yeah. Although sometimes some events are objectively painful, but then again,
Sure.
as we come back to the same conversation that we started, we can't always avoid unpleasant things happen to us. But a lot of the times we get to choose how we treat those events, and what do we get out of them.
Right. So we do have a lot of control, and even in the Soviet Union, probably, and this is a guess, but you could choose to accept your circumstances until you could change it, or you could just accept them and not worry about changing it, or you could be more unhappy and say it just has to change and work toward change. And all of those are different choices that one could make, I would think.
Well, change was a little questionable in the height of the Soviet Union, but a lot of people actually found the ways to express themselves, to stay true to the values, to not have to sell their soul to the devil. So there's always, in fact, that same Viktor Frankl writes about people. I mean, in concentration camps, you are as against the wall as can be, and even he's writing about a choice.
Michael J. Fox has come down with Parkinson's disease, or however you want to call it. But I remember early on, if I recall right, he went to a place in France where people constantly laugh, and it's part of their choice and it's part of their environment. And he went there because he wanted to learn how to be happier and more content with what was occurring in his life. And I guess he came back and felt that he had learned a great deal, because it's also about introspection and thinking about yourself and learning to teach yourself things too.
Mm-hmm. I do believe that people in Europe enjoy life more. I'm not sure if we are happier, but we do value we place a huge value on the process of living, not just working. And here maybe I'm a little bit unfair, but I have the impression that in America people are very much obsessed with work.
Way too focused on work sometimes, and they, as a result, don't see the fun part and haven't learned to figure out the fun part. So I think you're probably right. We focus so much on work that we leave the rest of life out.
Which would be actually quite okay if you love what you do.
Yeah. Well, so you speak a lot and you teach a lot, and you talk all about happiness and self-love and self-acceptance. How did you decide that was what you really wanted to do with your life?
Well, as I had started to tell my story, that wasn't my choice. My choice was first government, and then I thought I'd be more helpful to humanity if I went into charity and nonprofit. And then I ended up in Mindvalley, and I was on the business side of the company for many years. So helping other authors publish. I was never going to become a teacher or an author. It was never my plan. In fact, I never thought I had anything to share. You know, in my industry, everybody writes a book, so that idea of writing a book was always in the air. But for me, somewhere I thought, oh no, but I don't have anything to say. I just for the context, in school, we had a huge emphasis on literature, and I was brought up on classical literature from different countries. Just to understand how intense it was, we learned literature in the original language. So we were supposed to learn Greek and Latin to read ancient literature, which I didn't do, by the way. But for me, writing books was something otherworldly. But I think by the time I was 40, I had gone through my own discoveries and realizations and understandings, and of course, working with all those wonderful teachers and authors, it all rubs off, and you start creating your own theories in your head. So it wasn't a conscious decision that this is what I want to do. It's just that at some point the message was so ripe that I just couldn't hold it in. Like if you're pregnant with a baby, the baby has to come out when the baby is ready. So in my case, I just had to start speaking and teaching and writing a book.
Yeah, it just became what you had to do, and that makes sense. But it became your passion, and probably everything that happened before then built to that time.
Probably, yeah. We'll see. I still have hopefully a lot of years to go. Maybe I'll discover that was also built up to something.
Yeah. Well, that's what makes life fun and perhaps unpredictable, but still what makes it fun.
I agree.
Nothing wrong with discovery.
Yes, I think sometimes we take our life mission a little too seriously.
There you are.
Can
right?
evolve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I love that you not only quote people who are alive and real people, but that you do read fiction as well. I think that some of the best imagination has come from fiction writing, and there's nothing wrong with fiction. Again, if
God, I can't believe even that somebody would imagine that something is wrong. Well, not only imagination, a lot of the fiction is the forerunner of personal growth and transformation, because if you look at the things which have stayed on the surface of human attention, there have been always a lot of books written. Yeah. What we have right now is the best of the best. So if you look at some of the old works, authors have been asking themselves a question: how to be a better human for centuries. Mm-hmm. After all, even contemporary personal growth teachers refer to Stoics, who are like thousands of years old works, but they were philosophers. Of course, philosophy and personal growth are quite close enough areas. But for example, one of my favorite authors, Dostoevsky, his Russian novelist, considered himself a philosopher as much as a writer, and he was very much concerned with the evolution of human character and human spirit. But take almost any classic, they all ask themselves a question: what makes someone a good human being?
Sure. Well, even today, when you look at some of the more modern things like the Harry Potter series, everybody talks about Harry Potter as making children read more and so on. But when you look at it at the most basic level, it is all about what makes a person a good human being, and the fact that we can learn and we can discover more about ourselves than we ever thought we would be able to do.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a few gems in almost any work of fiction that you take. Of course, we have to recognize that there is fiction which is written just for pure entertainment. But in a way, it's like movies as well. How many wonderful, deep wisdoms do we find in some of the movies? And then there are movies which are for pure entertainment, and you feel ashamed that you have seen it occasionally. But,
until you realize that maybe there was a lesson there after all.
Maybe. So yes, I think, and that's the idea that I hold very dear, that there is learning in almost any experience that you have in your life, if you have the curiosity, the courage, and the presence of mind to just be aware, to notice, to ask yourself the questions, you really can learn from almost any interaction that's happening in your life. Learn about yourself, learn about the world, learn about other people.
And that's where it gets back to curiosity and making choices and really paying attention to self-discovery.
Yes. The best way for self-discovery is to actually be locked up with yourself for a long enough time.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from the original Muppet movie. And I can't remember if it was Fozzie Bear or somebody who said, "I am just beside myself." And the person, whoever it was, immediately shot back, "Yeah, can the two of you live together?" or something like that. It was really cute.
That's genius.
In fact,
when genius quotes come from very unlikely characters, I think it's always very invigorating.
Yeah.
You're like, wow.
That quote just came out so fast. And I actually was the second or third time I saw the movie that I heard it. It was just so clever. I went, oh my gosh. Or one of my favorite quotes, which isn't a fear quote, we were talking about that, but is still, it's a Star Wars quote from Yoda, do or do not. There is no try, which I think is absolutely true. You either do it and it gets back to choice again.
Yeah, Yoda is a source of wisdom.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. And Gandalf as well. We've referred
and Gandalf.
to him. So yeah, there's a lot of wisdom if you open to see it and notice it. And I've actually learned a lot reading novels. And sometimes unexpected things. For example, talking about being stuck with yourself, there's a quote by, of all people, Agatha Christie, who's the crime queen. But she has one of her characters says a wonderful thing. If you were to, I actually almost quoted that person, if you were to spend a lot of time with yourself, what would you discover about yourself?
Yeah.
And that was that novel was actually very brilliant from the psychological point of view. So yeah, you never know where you find the lesson.
Which book was that? Which novel was it? Do you remember?
That's it's called Lost in the Spring, and it's nowadays it's published under Agatha Christie, but she started and she wrote not just crime novels, right. So that's her non-crime novel,
right?
And she used to write under a different pseudonym. It was Mary Westmacott.
You certainly prioritize in your life a relationship with yourself, and you want to have a positive relationship. And I think that's important. It seems to me that we all ought to do more introspection than we do. And one of the things is I mentioned earlier to you, we're writing a new book, and we're going to talk a lot of that about introspection, because I think we never look enough at ourselves to really figure out what we're teaching ourselves. I used to say I'm my own worst critic, and I've learned that's a horrible thing to say, that it's much more appropriate to say I'm my own best teacher, because ultimately people can give me information, they can advise me, but they can't teach me. I have to decide to teach myself and to truly learn it. It still all comes from within. But when you're dealing with the relationship with you, how do you compare that and prioritize that in terms of relationships with other people?
We are just touching upon a very deep topic. So if we were to talk about relationship with the self, there is so much to cover. But I believe that your relationship with the world is a mirror reflection of your relationship with yourself. That's what I have experienced. I don't have research to back me up, but what I have experienced, that if you learn to be tolerant of your imperfections, it's much easier to be tolerant of other people's imperfections. If you learn to be forgiving towards yourself, it's much easier to forgive other people. And it goes into anything you touch, kindness, compassion, love. And so I believe that you have to sort out your relationship with yourself, because if you are at peace with yourself, it's so much easier to be at peace with the world around you.
Mm-hmm. And if you truly do that, you also discover not to be as judgmental as we tend to like to be, because we think it's so comfortable and comforting to say how much better we are than other people, and we got to get away from that.
Well, yeah, judgment is an interesting thing.
Yes.
I think if we replace judgment with curiosity, the world would be a much better place. But with that said, I also can appreciate a good whining session once in a blue moon. I think we all need to express, the other day I got very upset with a series of events. Sometimes a bad thing happened to you, and you're patient and you hold it in, and then the next thing happened, and the next thing happened, and at some point it can snap, and actually it does snap, and it's good if it does. So last week I had an episode, and I was just super lucky because I was going to my kickboxing class, but I still needed to drive there, and I was already on the verge. So what I did, thank God I was alone at home, I just made a roar. I was so angry.
There you go.
But you know what's interesting? I was sharing it with my kickboxing teacher that day, that I actually felt physical pleasure in expressing that feeling and in roaring, because, you know, the roar has this vibration and it makes your heart vibrate as well. And I wonder why I was talking that, but I guess I was leading to the idea is that, you know, we can't judge our life experience. We can't judge ourselves too hard. It's just not healthy. And it is healthy to sometimes let yourself be imperfect, and sometimes let yourself be wrong, and sometimes let yourself be angry, or all these things that we think, that we deem are horrible. Because expressing it is much healthier for you and for your environment than holding it in. You know, in psychology, there's such a phenomenon as emotional leakage. Just because you don't accept or allow certain unpleasant, painful, or unsavory emotions doesn't make them disappear. It's like hiding your head in the sand. They will stay. And the thing with our emotions is that if you don't live through them in a healthy way, they will start poisoning you, and at some point they will explode or leak, which is the root of passive aggressive behavior, which so many of us exhibit. So yeah, it's sometimes a good whining session is also good. The question is, what's your default regime? And if your default regime is judging, whining, and complaining, then that's a very definite red flag.
Yeah, there's probably some things to deal with when that happens. But the other side of that is, as we've talked about a lot today, if you go back and look at what happened and you do express your feelings about it, then it ultimately comes down to, now, what do I learn from it?
And what do I do with it?
And what do I do with it? Right, exactly. Well, speaking of doing, you are writing a book. Why don't you, if you would, tell us about Becoming Flawesome?
Yeah, Becoming Flawesome is exactly about recognizing your imperfections, and rather than demonizing them and trying to fix yourself, recognizing that, if you would try to fix yourself, you imply that you're broken. Very often humans are not broken, they're wounded, and that requires healing, not fixing. And when I talk about being flawesome, I talk about recognizing your imperfections, your dragons, your scratches, your dents, your wounds, whatever it is, or maybe your bad past, or whatever it is, recognizing that it's part of you and choosing for it to become your blessing rather than your curse.
How do you teach people, or what can you teach people about self-assessment and doing a better job of helping people assess themselves? Well,
I would have to answer that in two parts. First, I don't teach people. I don't believe in teaching.
Yeah, that's probably the wrong way to. But
no. It's because I am officially a teacher, but I don't believe in teaching because I think, and we were talking about that.
How do you help people discover?
I can share ideas, and people will hear when they're ready and when they want. I am rather a companion to people on their path to transformation than their teacher. Now, I'm not sure about self-assessment per se, because assessment sounds a little bit academic in my opinion. I more believe in just dancing with your life, going with the flow, and taking your life in the moment. So, of course, there are techniques. And I mean, I've been in personal growth for 20 years. So a lot of the teachers start with sitting you down and making you assess whatever area of your life that you want to improve, including probably yourself. Sorry. But I don't believe in recipes in life.
Yeah.
I think that what works for you today might not work for you tomorrow, and might not have been what you needed 10 years ago. What works for you might not work for another person. So I don't believe in recipes in life. I don't believe in tutorials and to-do lists and not to-do lists. I believe that life is literally a dance. And a dance means that you have to feel your partner, you have to feel the music, you have to be aware of your environment, and yes, we drill the steps and we practice, but ultimately you can't prepare yourself for life in the sense that it keeps happening to you all the time. It's not that you do your personal growth and transformation and then you can live happily ever after. It doesn't work like that. You keep doing it all your life. So because of that, I'm not a huge fan of assessing. I know there are a lot of tools for assessment, and there are a lot of systems which put you in boxes and tell you what you are. I believe in curiosity. I'm translating and quoting one wonderful teacher that I interviewed years ago. He had this interesting expression in Russian, though, that you have to touch life with your bare hand.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be a little bit odd, but that's exactly what I believe in. Life is happening in this very present moment. Can you feel it? Can you live it? And can you enjoy it to the maximum? Whatever it gives you, can you squeeze the juice out of it?
Right.
And that's why what I share with people is the system of staying honest and kind to yourself, and being curious and brave, courageous, and just not shying away from life.
Well, and self-assessment, using that word, is probably not the best word to have used, but I'm a firm believer in, even at the end of the day and maybe even at the beginning of the day, looking at what goes on, let's take at the end of the day, and saying, gee, how did that go? How was that? What could I do to even make it better? Or something didn't go well. What can I do with it? And so assessment isn't really right, because you're right, it puts in boxes, but there's nothing wrong with us looking at the things that we do and looking for that internal spirit in us to teach us how to make life even better or live life more to the fullest.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first question should be, I guess, am I enjoying it? Is that what I want? Or do I want to change anything about it? But I do recommend I would say 3 practices. One of them is absolutely fundamental for any kind of transformation, is obviously the habit or the skill of being aware of what's going on, because everything starts with awareness. Unless you're aware, you can't change things.
Yeah.
But I keep it as a separate concept, because it's not a practice per se. It's more like a mode that you switch on and then you can't switch it off anymore. Excuse me, my throat is giving way a little bit. But the 2 practices that I strongly recommend is the practice of journaling and introspection, in fact, combined, because journaling allows you to put vague sensations into words, and it really helps to crystallize and to bring clarity to what's going on. Sometimes we rush through life without putting our finger on the pulse. So when you journal, you're kind of forced to be a little bit more clear about what's going on. And introspection, of course, because introspection for me is one of the favorite things. Everything in my life is, so what does it say about me?
Yeah. Or what does it say about what I should do the next time it happens again? But yeah, introspection is exactly, I think, the right term to use. And we just don't do enough of it in our lives. We're too busy, as you said, like with work and so on. We worry so much about all of that we never enjoy life, and we never enjoy the absolute thrill of introspection in our own minds.
Mm-hmm. I would only warn against being very critical and judgmental.
Exactly. That you've got to stay away from that. That's, I think, totally different than introspection.
And yeah, there are so many questions you can ask yourself about anything that's happening in your life. And actually, if you do turn experiences inward and see your interaction with your life's events, then you do learn a lot about yourself. It's inevitable.
If you had one piece of practical advice that you could give to everyone listening, what would it be? I know. Is that an open-ended question or what?
No. I could give so much advice.
I know.
And that's probably a very thankless thing to do. But I will quote again from a movie, from Cinderella in the production of 2005. And there's this quote by Cinderella's mother who says, "Have courage and be kind." And I think that's one of the best advices.
I think that absolutely makes sense. And there's no better piece of advice than we could ever give in life. Have courage and be kind, period. There's never anything wrong with doing that. Well, I've really enjoyed doing this, and I wasn't sure how we were going to get through a whole hour, and look at us. We're getting your throat to be thirsty, and it's been almost 70 minutes, and this has absolutely been fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful and very engaged conversation. I enjoyed real life conversations.
How can people learn more about you, maybe reach out to you and learn about courses and so on from Mindvalley, but just reach out to you in general?
So my biggest project of this year, of course, is the launch of my book. So the best thing to know about me is to get my book, of course. And you will find me on Mindvalley, of course. I'm a co-founder of Mindvalley, so I'm there along with a lot of wonderful
Mindvalley.com, right?
Yes, it's mindvalley.com. And if you want to get my book, then I would recommend getting it from mindvalley.com/book/Flawesome.
Is Mindvalley publishing the book?
No, I'm being published. No. We don't publish traditional books.
Okay.
Mindvalley has published my courses, of course.
Right.
But we don't publish traditional books. It's a different, somewhat different business model. So I am being published by Hay House.
Okay. Well, when people hear this, please go out and get Kristina's book. We'll appreciate it, and she certainly will appreciate it, being a poor, starving author. I always love to say that. I ask people to go buy Thunderdog all the time because we're poor, starving authors, and we need people to buy our books. And besides, my guide dog Alamo needs kibbles, and so people need to go buy the books so that we have kibbles for Alamo.
I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here, and I thank you for listening. We'd love to hear from you. I would really appreciate you reaching out and letting me know what you think about today's podcast. We hope that you loved it and that you'll give us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you're listening and observing the podcast. We appreciate that very much. If you'd like to reach out to me, please do so. You can reach me at michaelhi@accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to michaelhingson.com/podcast. Hingson is HINGSON. But again, we really appreciate you being here. And Kristina, I really am very happy that we had a chance to do this, and hopefully we can do it some more.
Thank you, Michael, for having me. I truly appreciate it. And yes, hopefully that's not the last conversation.
No, let's have more, don't you think?
Yes. Maybe I should have you on my podcast, by the way.
We could do that.
Yeah.
Tell me about your podcast.
Well, I have my interviews about twice a week, and I interview wonderful people, and I like to talk about the things that we talked about. So I would, of course, need to talk about your topics more than anything. And by the way, I would be very happy to talk about courage and facing fear, because and that's what your book is about, right? So that would be super interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for being here, and we will do it.
Good.